Hello, so I'm Nicole. I am an associate lecturer at the University of St Andrews, and I am also a PhD researcher. Today I'm here to talk to you about digital museum objects and their propensity for polyvocality and cultural memory. So I am an ex-digital museum person. I have worked in the sector, but I am now a digital museum researcher. My current research examines the perception of the digital museum object in the cultural sector and its potential impact upon the formation of wider social, cultural, and transcultural memory. So essentially, what I'm doing is positioning the digital museum object as an object in its own right and evaluating how its increasingly abundant presence is transforming the museum's role in the creation and preservation of cultural and transcultural memory. So currently there is no widely agreed upon definition of a digital museum object, so I'll begin with my own working definition. I consider a digital museum object to be an object created as a true and faithful image of a physical museum object or a born digital creation, alongside all of its associated and critically important data. So yes, it's a copy, it's a facsimile, it's a replica in 2D or 3D, but I am suggesting that in thinking about it in these terms, we are forcing it to occupy a lower position in a hierarchical system of value, and that we fail to understand its true impact upon our memory processes. If we first consider briefly typical interactions with digital museum objects, our own and our audiences, which are both part of this process. These can take place either in the physical gallery, in a digital interactive, or online in an exhibition, collections portal, or in our own cases, behind the scenes in our content or collections management systems. For many people now, the digital object is the primary, or indeed the only way that they interact with a collections item. In the digital arena, the visitor is fundamentally more empowered. They arrive at and encounter objects after directing their own journey towards them. Their search terms and filtering create assemblages of objects of their own making that often don't resonate with those of the museum. So this is a collection search here in the Rijksmuseum for frog, which was the first thing that popped into my mind, I don't know why, and faceted by 20th century. So we can see a really interesting selection of objects here that we wouldn't normally put together. So thus, each digital museum object is viewed in a unique set of circumstances, dictated by the museum, but now more often than not the visitor, affecting how it's perceived, remembered, and valued culturally. I believe that it's precisely the sum of these interactions that imbues digital museum objects with a certain type of cultural value, one that differs from the physical object, one that is inherently more user-directed. The cumulative mass and diversity of the interactions and engagements with these objects accrete around them, cementing their importance culturally and socially. Importantly, these interactions are between both museum professional and object and visitor, and we can imagine a situation where neither of these types of interaction are privileged over another. So is this that we should consciously be thinking about preserving and making accessible as a record of public memory? So basically, from creation to interaction, this process I'm thinking about is quite long and complex. So recently I decided to start at the beginning by thinking about how we as museum professionals create, edit, publish, and interpret digital objects, and how this affects what reaches the public. I began by interviewing museum professionals at the Smithsonian. I conducted interviews in the US and the UK, but I started at the Smithsonian because I was mostly interested in thinking about how an institution or people who work for an institution that has recently published a strategy, a digital-first strategy, that aims to reach 1 billion people per year think about digital objects. I also spoke with professionals in the UK, and I took these responses and contextualized them within my wider research. I interviewed curators, digitizers, programmers, learning and access curators to get a wide source of opinions, and I used a semi-structured approach, asking each consistent questions. The questions I asked aimed to elicit the precise nature of their interactions with digital museum objects. I wanted to understand exactly how they conceptualized the digital object, what they thought about its worth and value, and if they considered it as having use and impact beyond the documentary. So some of my findings were pretty much confirmation of what I'm sure we all already know in this room, but there were some interesting similarities and differences of opinion, and a general feeling that we still remain in this sort of state of transition when we are thinking about digital museum objects. And so though responses varied amongst interviewees, often connected to previous and current academic and professional experience, some overarching themes emerged. And the most prevalent of these, and the most interesting to me, was that the answer to nearly every question posed considered that digital museum object in relation to its physical counterpart. There didn't seem to be too much of a separation. And now I'm not advocating that we should separate these completely and just think about them as two totally different entities. But there is a different mode of thinking to be had if we just conduct this thought experiment. And so this relationship does make sense for many of the questions asked. For example, when I asked about the nature of the digital museum object, that was often defined through people's interactions and physical bodily interactions with it, as we would think about describing our own interactions with physical museum objects. So one participant said, there's a tangible thing you can see, hear, and relate to. You can use all of your senses to understand it, but you can't use all of the same senses as with the physical object. So that caveat kind of speaks to this inferior position that the digital museum object is still occupying. But others did echo this statement: whether I can touch it or not is not the thing, but I can't touch a museum object either. This is almost like an equalizing statement, like we're trying to reach some sort of parity again. So again, the digital museum object is judged, at least in this set of interviews, as inferior in terms of sensory engagement. Many of the facets or worth or value, I should say, were often tied to the physical. So someone said there's a value in the digital version, but if you lose that, you won't be as worried as if you lose the real thing. The real thing was a recurrent concept that kept coming up. If the physical disappears, then having the virtual can be very valuable. And we see lots of examples of this. This is just one of the 3D holographic projection onto the space once occupied by the Buddha statues in Bamiyan, Afghanistan. So really speaking to this idea, the value of the digital is inextricably tied to the state of the physical, whether that's its fragility, accessibility, or even its existence. The digital is always seen as a conduit to the physical. But interestingly, when we divorce the physical counterpart and consider the digital alone, different facets of value emerged. And it's this that I believe highlights the potential impact of the digital object upon that formation of social and transcultural memory that I mentioned earlier. One digitization project manager said, there's something compelling about real-life objects. They'll always be compelling, but there's a certain type of compelling use that you can get out of the digital objects. This certain type of compelling use is the opening up and offering of new possibilities. In the space between the object and the individual, as some people refer to as the contact zone in the literature, cultural value is added through new types of interactions and engagement. The object acts as a nexus or meeting point of different interpretations, each shaping and moulding one another, where the museum can be challenged as well, really importantly, and harking back to the quote we saw from Richard Sandel in Simon's presentation there, where we basically reconstitute different tropes of knowledge. So the museum being challenged is always a good thing, in my opinion. The record of these paints a picture of prevailing trends around transcultural memory at any one point in time. And the example I have here is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's exhibition, Some Were Neighbors. Now, this was a parallel physical and digital exhibition where people were asked to reflect and share their thoughts, feelings, and interpretations of digital museum objects, either in the physical exhibition through an online kiosk or a digital kiosk, or online through a comment sharing section. This was populated with photographs, excerpts from journals, and digitized objects. And people really used these objects as inspiration to talk about this specific time in history. And if you analyze these comments, you can see that they interact with each other, and there are different types of remembering happening in different areas, different organizations, different geographical regions. So thinking about these as a group is a really important thing to do. When we think about the object itself, there was another quality that came up in my interviews. One digitization project manager said that the digital object can become an original object itself. It maybe takes on this new kind of, for lack of a better word, aura of a type of original that was the progenitor of whatever cleaves off of it. Now, this is a really interesting thing to unpack, and this particular person was referring to this 3D scanned woolly mammoth skeleton. Now, I don't know if most of you are familiar with this, but this was scanned by the Smithsonian and placed online open source. A toy maker who resided in Japan then went and downloaded it and created some tweaks there. So they stabilized the feet and articulated the limbs and essentially made a toy or an interactive physical print that could be used to think about this object in a new way. So there are also two things to unpack in this statement. First, that the digital museum object is held as an original, which is a term that is usually really reserved for the physical, and that it's endowed with this ability to spawn new objects, but only through interaction with people. And the second and related thing is this use of the troubled notion of aura, which again usually refers to the digital and is often been cited as lacking in the physical. Another interviewee stated when asked about the digital museum object, "It's not the same because that connection isn't there. The real thing makes the events that it saw real." They're talking about the physical object here. But my point is does it have to be the same, the aura of the digital, as the physical? Can we not think of it in new terms? Might the digital museum object's aura simply be different rather than absent? Perhaps it's the cumulative total of the interactions and engagements that I talked about. These comments, tags, sharing, editing, that create the aura or the virtual patina of this digital object. And perhaps it's also the propensity to capture the polyvocal interpretation that gives aura to the digital museum object. And this is an aura that can be captured and preserved, perhaps in our collections management systems, although that's quite ambitious. On a larger scale, we might be able to see patterns in this activity pointing towards shifts and trends of memory. As one interviewee noted, if we're doing things with digital objects, how do we visualize interactions around them? Well, how? Why not envisage a network? In this network diagram, dots are nodes, are objects, are people, and lines are edges, are relationships between them. So objects are connected to objects, people to people, but most importantly for us, objects to people. And the relationships between them mean that the object and the person can affect change on one another. It's difficult but not impossible to plot networks of interactions around digital museum objects. And with this, we can create a picture of a certain type of value. In times when debates around alternative facts and post-truths are prevalent, it's really important for us to advocate why an object is culturally valuable in a very transparent manner from multiple perspectives. Visualizing the process in an accessible manner allows us to show this to the public and preserve the nature of the interactions in some form. Such an approach also captures many interpretations of museum objects, and they become polyvocal. So we challenge that instituted trope of knowledge and invite many interpretations in. When publics and museums enter into iterative dialogues about their objects, neither is privileged over the other, and these can be preserved side by side, transforming the museum as a memory institution. In today's post-digital, globally connected world, cultures overlap, intertwine, and merge, and digital museum objects in their numinous existence can exist as a locus of this and capture dialogues across social, cultural, and geographical borders.